Karen's carefully constructed world began crumbling around her. She'd been so focused on maintaining control, on enforcing every rule in the HOA handbook, that she'd never considered the consequences of her escalating behavior. "I was protecting our community," she insisted, but her voice sounded shrill even to her own ears. "You were harassing your neighbors," Officer Martinez corrected. "And now Mrs. Johnson wants to press charges." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. Charges. Criminal charges. She thought of her position on the HOA board, her reputation as the neighborhood watchdog, her membership in the prestigious Willowbrook Country Club. All of it could disappear. What? What kind of charges? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Harassment, trespassing, making false reports, possibly stalking. Given the pattern of behavior, Officer Martinez closed his notepad with a decisive snap. "But Mrs. Johnson is willing to discuss alternatives." Karen perked up slightly. "Alternatives?" "She wants you to publicly apologize at tomorrow night's HOA meeting. She wants you to resign from the compliance committee. And she wants a guarantee that you'll stop surveilling her property." Resign? Karen's voice cracked. The compliance committee was her life, her purpose, her source of power in the neighborhood hierarchy. Without it, she was just another suburban housewife with too much time and too many opinions. "Those are her terms," Officer Martinez said, standing up. "You have until tomorrow night to decide. Either way, I'll be filing a report about today's incident." After he left, Karen wandered through her immaculate house, feeling lost in her own space. Every room was perfectly coordinated, every surface gleaming, every throw pillow precisely positioned. It was exactly as sterile and controlled as she'd made her entire neighborhood experience. But now the control was slipping away, and Karen wasn't sure who she was without it. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed HOA President Janet Mills. Karen stared at the phone, knowing that whatever Janet had to say would only make things worse. But she'd never backed down from a fight before, and she wasn't about to start now. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. "Hello, Janet. I suppose you've heard about today's incident." The Willowbrook Community Center had never felt smaller to Karen as she stood before the packed crowd of neighbors, her carefully prepared resignation letter trembling in her hands. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls. More attendance than the annual budget meeting had ever drawn. Mrs. Johnson sat in the front row, her phone conspicuously placed on the table before her. Karen could see her own mortified face reflected in its black screen. Karen began, then cleared her throat. 15 years of commanding these meetings, and now she could barely speak. "I owe you all an apology." Someone in the back coughed. The sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. "My dedication to maintaining our community standards may have exceeded appropriate boundaries." Each word felt like swallowing glass. Karen had practiced this speech for hours, but it sounded hollow and scripted even to her own ears. From the middle section, Tom Henderson raised his hand. "Is it true you've been climbing into people's yards to measure their pool setbacks?" Karen's face burned. "The HOA bylaws clearly state." "That's not what I asked," Tom interrupted. "Did you trespass on private property to enforce rules that don't actually exist in our current bylaws?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Karen glanced at Janet Mills, silently pleading for intervention, but the HOA president just stared back with barely concealed disgust. The pool proximity regulations are outlined in Section 12B was removed in 2019, called out David Chen from the back. "I was on the revision committee. We eliminated the pool setback requirements because they were unenforceable." Karen's mouth went dry. She'd been enforcing a rule that hadn't existed for 4 years. All those measurements, all those heated phone calls, all those sleepless nights planning her enforcement strategies, based on outdated information she'd never bothered to verify. Furthermore, David continued, standing up now, "I've been reviewing Mrs. Whitfield's violation reports from the past year. 87% of them reference bylaws that are either outdated, misinterpreted, or completely fabricated." The crowd began murmuring, heads turning toward Karen with expressions ranging from confusion to outright anger. She recognized the faces. people she'd cited for unauthorized mailbox colors, people she'd reported for excessive Christmas decorations, people she'd harassed about their landscaping choices. "That's impossible," Karen whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was true. She'd been so focused on maintaining control that she'd never actually updated her rulebook. She'd been operating from a 15-year-old copy of the bylaws, cross-referenced with her own increasingly creative interpretations. Mrs. Johnson stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and theatrical. "I'd like to share something with everyone," she announced, holding up her phone. Karen's knees went weak. "Please, that's not necessary. This is security footage from my backyard camera, taken last Tuesday at 5:47 a.m. Mrs. Johnson's voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent room. On her phone screen, clearly visible to everyone in the front rows, was Karen crouched behind a garbage can, furiously taking notes while Mrs. Johnson's automatic sprinkler system went through its morning cycle. In the video, Karen looked exactly like what she was, a deranged person obsessed with other people's business. "I counted 17 separate incidents of trespassing in the past month alone," Mrs. Johnson continued. "Would anyone like to see more footage?" The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped in anger, confusion, and disbelief. Karen heard fragments. "Called my boss. Measuring my deck at midnight. Tried to get my dog declared a public nuisance." Janet Mills finally stood up, gaveling for order. "Mrs. Whitfield, in light of these revelations, the board has no choice but to accept your resignation from all HOA positions, effective immediately." Karen's resignation letter fluttered to the floor. She'd spent hours crafting careful language that would preserve some dignity, some hint that she'd been acting in the community's best interests. Now it didn't matter. But as the crowd continued their angry discussions, Karen felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in years, she didn't have to measure anything, monitor anyone, or enforce rules she apparently didn't even understand. The weight she'd been carrying, the constant vigilance, the exhausting paranoia, the crushing responsibility of keeping an entire neighborhood in line, suddenly lifted from her shoulders. She walked out of the community center without another word, leaving behind 15 years of self-appointed authority and manufactured purpose. But as she drove home through the neighborhood she tried so hard to control, Karen noticed something that made her pull over and stare. A "for sale" sign had appeared in the Johnsons' front yard, and it was positioned exactly 3 inches over the property line. 3 weeks after the infamous HOA meeting, Karen stood in her kitchen making coffee for one. Gary had moved in with his sister, temporarily, a word that was beginning to sound increasingly permanent. The house felt different without his presence, emptier, but somehow less suffocating. She'd expected the neighborhood to erupt in chaos without her vigilant oversight. Instead, something remarkable had happened. Absolutely nothing. The lawns remained mowed, the mailboxes stayed upright, and life continued exactly as it had before. Only now Karen wasn't documenting every minor infraction in her color-coded violation log. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m., a time Karen recognized because she used to begin her neighborhood patrol rounds at this hour. Mrs. Johnson stood on her doorstep, but instead of the victorious smirk Karen expected, her neighbor looked genuinely concerned. "Karen, we need to talk," she said, holding up a manila folder thick with documents. "If this is about pressing charges, it's not." Mrs. Johnson stepped inside without invitation, a move that would have sent the old Karen into apoplectic rage. Now it just seemed normal. "It's about the Hendersons' house." Karen followed her former enemy into the living room, where Mrs. Johnson spread photographs across the coffee table. They showed the Henderson property from multiple angles, but something was clearly wrong. The landscaping looked professionally maintained, the house was freshly painted, and everything appeared perfect, too perfect. "I've been watching their place since they went on vacation 2 weeks ago," Mrs. Johnson explained. "These photos were taken yesterday." Karen studied the images, her trained eye immediately spotting the discrepancies. The roses were pruned, the hedges were trimmed. Someone's been maintaining the property. "But here's the thing," Mrs. Johnson continued, pulling out more photos. "The Hendersons are in Europe for 3 months. They didn't hire a maintenance service. And look at this. Karen Whitfield stood in her pristine kitchen, clutching her morning coffee with white knuckles as she watched Officer Martinez wade into her neighbor's backyard pool, fully clothed, badge and all. The sight made her eye twitch uncontrollably. This is what happens when people don't follow HOA regulations. She shrieked at her husband Gary, who was trying to hide behind his newspaper. I told them that pool was 3 inches too close to the property line. What Karen didn't mention was that she'd been the one to call the police, claiming she'd seen suspicious activity at the Johnson residence. She'd expected them to cite the pool violation. She hadn't expected Officer Martinez to slip on the wet deck and tumble backward into the chlorinated water while trying to peer over the fence. The doorbell rang. Karen smoothed her leopard print robe and marched to answer it, expecting to see a soggy, apologetic police officer ready to issue citations. Instead, she found Mrs. Johnson holding a dripping smartphone and wearing a smile that could cut glass. "Karen, honey," Mrs. Johnson said sweetly, "I have the most interesting video footage from my security cameras." Karen's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble entryway. The brown liquid splashed across her pristine white slippers, the ones she'd special ordered from Italy and worn exactly twice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Karen stammered, but her voice cracked like a teenager's. "Oh, but I think you do." Mrs. Johnson held up the phone, showing Karen a clear video of herself crouched behind the Henderson's rose bushes at 6 a.m., measuring tape in hand, frantically scribbling notes. "The timestamp shows you've been surveilling my property for weeks." Karen's face flushed crimson. She'd been so careful, so methodical in documenting every possible violation. The pool's proximity to the fence line, the unauthorized trellis, the garden gnome that clearly violated the HOA's tasteful lawn ornament clause. But she'd never considered that her neighbors might be watching her watch them. That's perfectly legal," Karen sputtered. "I'm the HOA compliance officer. I have a duty to trespass on private property at dawn, to file false police reports." Mrs. Johnson's smile grew wider. "Because that's exactly what Officer Martinez wants to discuss with you. He's changing clothes right now, but he'll be right over." Karen slammed the door and pressed her back against it, breathing heavily. Through the frosted glass, she could see Mrs. Johnson's silhouette, still standing there, still holding that damning phone. "Gary," she called out, but only silence answered her. When she turned toward the kitchen, she saw the sliding door to their backyard standing open, Gary's newspaper abandoned on the counter, his coffee still steaming in its mug. Her husband, her loyal, spineless husband, who never questioned her crusades, had fled. Karen was alone, and for the first time in 15 years of HOA tyranny, she had no idea what her next move should be. But she knew one thing for certain. This was war. 20 minutes later, Karen sat across from Officer Martinez in her formal dining room, the one she only used for intimidating neighbors during HOA disputes. The officer's uniform was still damp in places, and she could smell chlorine every time he moved. His notepad was soggy around the edges, but his pen worked just fine. "Mrs. Whitfield," he began, his voice professionally neutral, "we need to discuss your recent calls to the department." Karen straightened her shoulders, channeling every ounce of righteous indignation she'd perfected over the years. "I was simply reporting violations that affect our entire community's property values." 11 calls in the past month, Officer Martinez interrupted, consulting his waterlogged notes. Suspicious individuals checking mailboxes, which turned out to be postal workers. Illegal construction, which was a permitted deck repair. Noise violations, during acceptable daytime hours for lawn maintenance. "I have documentation. And now Mrs. Johnson has documentation too." He pulled out his own phone, showing Karen a crystal-clear video of herself jimmying the latch on the Johnson side gate at dawn. Breaking and entering, trespassing, harassment, filing false reports. "That's quite a list, Mrs. Whitfield." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. In the video, she looked exactly like what she was, a middle-aged woman in a leopard print robe, obsessively measuring pool dimensions with the dedication of a forensic investigator. "That gate was unlocked," she whispered, though even she knew how pathetic that sounded. Mrs. Johnson also provided recordings of your phone calls, Officer Martinez continued. Apparently, you called her employer 3 times last week, trying to get her fired for allowing her property to become a neighborhood eyesore. She pointed to a photo showing the Hendersons' garbage bins positioned at the curb. Trash day was Tuesday. Someone's been living there. Karen felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the thrill of discovering something that didn't belong, something out of place. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about enforcing arbitrary rules or maintaining her stranglehold on neighborhood compliance. This was about something potentially serious. Have you called the police? Karen asked. I thought about it, but then I realized, you know this neighborhood better than anyone. You'd notice things that I'd miss. Mrs. Johnson met Karen's eyes directly. I need your help. The words hung in the air between them. After weeks of public humiliation and social exile, Karen's former nemesis was asking for her expertise. Why would you trust me? Karen asked quietly. Because despite everything that happened, despite all the crazy measuring and rule enforcing, you actually care about this place. You pay attention to details. Mrs. Johnson gathered the photos into a neat stack. And because whoever's squatting in the Henderson house is good at staying hidden, they're only making minimal changes, being careful not to attract attention from anyone except someone who watches everything obsessively. Karen finished. Exactly. Karen walked to her window and looked out at the Henderson property. From this angle, she could see into their backyard, where she'd spent countless hours documenting their various violations. Now she noticed something she'd missed in the photos, a small pile of cigarette butts near the back door. The Hendersons were militant non-smokers who wouldn't even allow smoking guests on their property. There's someone there right now, Karen said suddenly. Second floor, master bedroom window. I just saw the curtain move. Mrs. Johnson joined her at the window, squinting toward the Henderson house. I don't see anything. But Karen was already reaching for her binoculars, the same ones she used for her neighborhood surveillance operations. Through the lenses, she could clearly see a figure moving around the Hendersons' bedroom, someone who definitely wasn't supposed to be there. We need to call the police, Karen said, but her voice carried a note of excitement she hadn't felt in weeks. As Mrs. Johnson dialed 911, Karen continued watching the house, her mind automatically cataloging details. The make and model of an unfamiliar car parked 3 houses down, the pattern of lights turning on and off, the way the intruder moved through rooms with obvious familiarity. For the first time since her public humiliation, Karen Whitfield felt useful again, but now her obsessive attention to detail served a legitimate purpose, protecting her neighbors instead of tormenting them. The question was, who was living in the Henderson house, and why had they chosen to hide in plain sight in a neighborhood where nothing escaped notice? As sirens wailed in the distance, Karen realized her war with the neighborhood was over, but a new mystery had just begun, and this time she wouldn't be fighting alone.